Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The book we are interpreting for you in this issue is the classic work, The Brothers Karamazov, by the Russian master writer Fyodor Dostoevsky. British writer Virginia Woolf had a highly commendable comment on Russian literature. She said that in 19th century Russian literature, there were enormous souls. Dostoevsky is indeed an outstanding representative of 19th century Russia. However, as ordinary readers, our more immediate experience is often the massive length of his works, filled with lengthy and profound dialogues on topics such as religion, philosophy, and politics. This is why novels like The Brothers Karamazov may seem a bit daunting to the general reader. Nevertheless, this book is still worth our time to read. Not only because of the superb narrative skill of the brothers Karamazov, but also because the author has created a group of characters who reflect their own temperament, pathology, and extremity. In their intense clashes, we can feel the highest intensity of passion. Dostoevsky was born in 1821 into a small noble family, ranking second among 7 children. He suffered from epilepsy, with the first seizure occurring at the age of 9, and it continued intermittently. At the age of 26, Dostoevsky joined a secret Western European socialist thinking group, discussing social issues weekly, attempting to reform the serfdom system in Tsarist Russia and the censorship system of the time. This experience brought him trouble. In 1849, he and other group members were arrested, and shortly after, he was sentenced to death. Just before the execution, a command came through, changing the death penalty to exile in Siberia. It wasn't until 1855 that he was pardoned, and 4 years later, he was allowed to return to St. Petersburg. His life of hardship clearly had a strong impact on his spirit, and played a significant role in his ideological transformation. He abandoned his radical stance against the government, and became a true Slavophile. The Slavophiles were one of the main intellectual currents in 19th century Russian society. They, along with the opposing Westernizers, had intense disagreements and debates on issues such as the future path of Russia and the dominant forces in society. The two factions' viewpoints were in opposition. The Slavophiles' main idea was to criticize the Westernization path, intending to resist the turbulent currents and draw precious spiritual nourishment from Russian traditional culture and institutions, resisting Western influence, and reshaping the direction of social development. One of their most important ideological resources was the Eastern Orthodox tradition that had profoundly influenced Russian society since the 15th century. After going through twists and turns in his thoughts and life, in his later years, Dostoevsky embraced Slavophile ideas, passionately pursuing the Russian spirit. His idealization of Eastern Orthodoxy is fully reflected in the protagonist of The Brothers Karamazov, the Eastern Orthodox monk Alyosha Karamazov. The Brothers Karamazov is Dostoevsky's last work before his death. However, it's hard to imagine that these works were written in such economic hardship. Dostoevsky was addicted to gambling and spent money on extramarital affairs. Due to the torment he endured, he went bald early, had an unimpressive appearance, and was not at all attractive to women. However, he persisted, treating women with the passion of a gambler. Gambling, coupled with love, led him into an abyss. He had to rob Peter to pay Paul, writing novels at breakneck speed to earn income. Both Crime and Punishment and The Gambler were completed in almost manic anxiety, with The Gambler taking only 26 days to write. But The Brothers Karamazov is by no means a rushed work. The conception of this novel took nearly 10 years, and the actual writing took 2 years. Moreover, it was originally part of the author's grander writing plan. Dostoevsky intended it as the beginning of a series of novels. Unfortunately, in early 1881, when he was preparing to write the second part of The Brothers Karamazov, one morning, in order to pick up a fallen penholder, he moved a cabinet, leading to a ruptured blood vessel. Death came suddenly, leaving us with countless possibilities and endless speculation. Now, let's take a look at what this work, The Brothers Karamazov, which changed the world of literature with only half of it written, is really about. The novel is set in the mid-19th century, the same period as the author's, and the story revolves around the life of the Karamazov family. This family consists only of men, with no women, Old Karamazov's 2 wives have both passed away, leaving only the father, 3 sons, and an illegitimate child. Old Karamazov is greedy and lecherous, competing with his eldest son for the affection of a seductive woman. One dark night, suspecting that his lover is having an affair with his father, the eldest son breaks into the house, and in a fit of rage, nearly kills his father. After hastily fleeing, the illegitimate son, who was pretending to be sick in the shadows, quietly murders old Karamazov, causing a sensational national bloodshed. The core plot of who is the murderer leads the novel down the path of a detective story in terms of theme and form. The packaging of these detective elements stimulates the reader's curiosity, keeping the text enveloped in an atmosphere of deep suspicion throughout. Old Karamazov is referred to by locals as the landlord. He is morally corrupt, lascivious, and greedy, with the money he possesses squeezed from his 2 wives. His first wife, from a prestigious family, married him out of innocence and romance. The moment she received her dowry, all her money, including estates and properties, went to her husband. Later, this young lady from a noble family couldn't endure living with him, left home, and ended up dying in a distant place. His second wife was a pitiful orphan, tortured by him into madness. Shortly after giving birth to 2 sons, she also died. Old Karamazov's 3 sons were separated and entrusted to relatives for adoption from a young age, only returning home when they were grown. The eldest son, Dmitri, entered military school without completing high school, later served in the Caucasus, indulged in revelry, spent extravagantly, and upon returning home, discovered that the inheritance he should rightfully receive had already been taken by his father, leaving him with nothing. The second son, Ivan, showed exceptional academic talent from a young age. He attended university, and to support himself, he traveled from place to place writing reviews for various newspapers and magazines, gaining some reputation in literary circles. Later, this knowledgeable and insightful young man unexpectedly returned to his father's house, living there month after month, surprising many. The youngest son, Alyosha, is the complete opposite of his father's personality, possessing a Christ-like compassion from a young age. A year before graduating from high school, he returned home, visited his father, paid respects at his mother's grave, and then made a decision to enter a monastery. From then on, he became an aspiring monk. Old Karamazov's illegitimate son is named Smerdyakov. His mother was a wandering, mentally unstable woman, and after old Karamazov had a drunken encounter with her, the child born was adopted by an old servant. Growing up, he retained the status of a servant, with a dark and cruel personality that made him unpredictable. In the brothers Karamazov, the father is completely derelict, lacking any qualifications to be a father. The father-son relationship presented in the novel is full of tension. Old Karamazov is despicable and cruel, causing his sons to detest him from the core, making any sense of closeness impossible. Moreover, the hatred between father and sons is particularly concentrated in the relationship between old Karamazov and his eldest son Dmitri. Economic factors and romantic entanglements, both father and son pursuing the same woman, result in frequent clashes, with the son even injuring the father in the process. The farcical father-son dispute concludes with old Karamazov's tragic death. However, readers feel no sadness at this point because, given the plot's development, the victim seems to deserve his fate. In both plot and character setting, we can see shadows of the author's own life. For example, the event of the father being murdered has a clear prototype. Dostoevsky's father, in his later years, moved to a rural estate, became irritable due to alcoholism, and was exceptionally cruel to the servants, ultimately being killed by a group of serfs. Additionally, the elder son Dmitri's gambling addiction and the second son Ivan's epilepsy can be seen as projections of the author's personal temperament. Regarding the intense conflict setting and emotional characters, author Nabokov, of Lolita fame, was highly dissatisfied. He believed that Dostoevsky took the wrong path, asserting that he was more suited to be a playwright than a novelist, and the brothers Karamazov is a scattered script. He mocked that we should not consider the reactions of those who come from mental hospitals and must return there as a universal human experience. In fact, the controversy itself may be the necessary test of the work's greatness. The founder of psychoanalysis, Freud, wrote a dedicated analysis of this book, making the brothers Karamazov a classic text in modern psychology. For Freud, this novel is undoubtedly the best evidence of the Oedipus complex. He argued that the motive for patricide is sexual competition, and in this novel, there seems to be quite compelling evidence. Both old Karamazov and his eldest son are chasing after the same woman, leading to frequent conflicts. Another prominent writer, Malm, offered a sympathetic interpretation of similar issues. Dostoevsky's uniqueness lies precisely in the extreme contradictions presented by the author and the work. In this seemingly foolish sentimentality, there is an infusion of pressing anguish and confusion. The characters' actions in the brothers Karamazov cannot be measured by the usual standards of everyday life. They are not portrayals of real life, not typical characters, but rather symbolic representations of passion, desire, debauchery, and evil. It can be said that the brothers Karamazov, this novel, creates a series of almost archetypal characters, and the conflict between characters is primarily carried out through dialogue rather than action. Dialogue is the predominant form in the novel, determining its basic stance, not to conceal and evade the truth but to constantly confide and investigate. The extensive and ongoing character dialogues infuse the novel with a hysterical temperament. However, within this frenzied outpouring of language, there is also a reflection of meticulous and unyielding logical spirit, relentlessly advancing through tireless debates. Critics generally consider the novel's first protagonist to be the youngest son, Alyosha. However, the dramatic conflict is mainly manifested between old Karamazov and his eldest son Dmitri because they are both enamored with the same woman. Grushenka is a locally famous seductress who was abandoned by a Polish officer in her youth and is now kept by an elderly merchant. Simultaneously, she maintains relationships with both father and son, the Karamazovs. Grushenka, a typical witch with a dual personality in Dostoevsky's portrayal, is promiscuous, unscrupulous, and uncontrollable, yet she exudes a compelling charm with an imposing, warm, and kind side. When the spiritual protagonist Alyosha first sees her, he is shaken by her beauty, even experiencing spasms. In his eyes, that was the Russian feminine beauty that drove all mankind crazy. It's worth noting that this evaluation is presented in the author Dostoevsky's tone, reproducing the language or thoughts of the novel's character Alyosha, without using any direct quotation marks such as he said or he thought. This narrative form transcends the boundary between the character's thoughts and the narrator's thoughts. The phrase that was the Russian feminine beauty that drove all mankind crazy is both Alyosha's thought and can also be understood as the author's own sentiment. It can be said that in the character of Grushenka, Dostoevsky invests a spiritual longing for the Russian psyche. For the embodiment of this Russian feminine beauty, Dmitri not only becomes estranged from his father but also decides to abandon his fiancée Katerina. Katerina and Grushenka have contrasting personalities but are equally tension-filled and captivating. Katerina's father is Dmitri's superior in the military, and due to her father's financial troubles, she gathers immense courage to visit Dmitri at night, borrowing money from him. In this process, Katerina inexplicably falls in love with Dmitri, who is incompatible with her, and resolves to marry him. Subsequently, she closely follows without letting go. This girl has a strong sense of pride, even a bit of arrogance. She looks down on Grushenka but tries to win her over to make her give up Dmitri. However, her attempts backfire, leading her to angrily scold the other as a hussy and vile creature, embarrassing herself. Later, she falls in love with the second son Ivan but behaves extremely reserved. Katerina's attitude of being completely obedient to her brother Dmitri while being indifferent to herself causes pain to Ivan. These two female protagonists, Katerina's youthful tension and Grushenka's unrestrained charm, form a highly dramatic combination. Their relationships with their respective male partners also demonstrate corresponding combinations. Dmitri and Grushenka represent a down-to-earth Russian temperament. Their emotional passion is intense, intimidating, yet possesses a kind of touching innocence. On the other hand, Ivan and Katerina tend towards rationality, sharing intellectual similarities and being more elite, products of the Europeanization trend. Especially Ivan, deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinking, has distanced himself from his homeland on a spiritual level. However, the author burdens him with epilepsy, entwining his confidence in reason with nightmares about the devil, resulting in inner struggles and endless suffering. On the night the crime occurred, Dmitri suspected Grushenka of secretly meeting his father, and in a fit of rage, broke into the house, even injuring the old servant. Consequently, after the murder of old Karamazov, Dmitri was naturally assumed to be the culprit, and was sentenced to exile in Siberia. However, at the same time, the novel explicitly tells us that the true culprit is the illegitimate son Smerdyakov, who used a paperweight to fatally strike his own illegitimate father. If patricide is considered the core plot of the novel, then, as a fact, it is also full of doubts. This is not to say that there is another real culprit, but rather, if determining the murder charge from the perspective of inner motives, Smerdyakov is by no means the only perpetrator. In fact, the Karamazov brothers, in some form, could all have killed their father. The eldest son Dmitri openly roared at his father, "Why let such a creature live in the world?" However, the character among the three brothers most consciously aware of patricide is not the eldest son Dmitri or the youngest son Alyosha, but the second son Ivan. In the novel, Ivan gradually realizes that he is an accomplice of Smerdyakov and, one could even say, the mastermind behind the murder. This self-realization goes through a process, specifically reflected in Ivan's 3 visits to Smerdyakov after the tragic incident. The first visit is when Ivan returns from Moscow for the funeral and goes to the hospital to see Smerdyakov, who is hospitalized due to epilepsy. Smerdyakov, in a peculiar tone, tells Ivan that he believes Ivan might have anticipated the murder because he had advised Ivan to go to the nearby town of Chermashnya instead of Moscow, suggesting that in case of trouble, it would be better to come back promptly. However, Ivan did not heed his advice. Smerdyakov draws a conclusion. Ivan chose to go to the distant Moscow to escape from a place of controversy, to hide somewhere. Upon hearing this, Ivan naturally feels anger. Nevertheless, as he walks out of the hospital, he feels relieved, and the reason for his relief lies precisely in the fact that, at this moment, the one assumed to be guilty is not Smerdyakov but his elder brother Dmitri. This is a subtle and irrational thought, and the reason behind it prompts Ivan's instinctive avoidance. He does not want to delve deeper and just wants to forget as quickly as possible. However, seemingly compelled by fate, Ivan visits Smerdyakov again after his release from the hospital. This time, Smerdyakov turns implications into threats, confronts Ivan, lays his cards on the table, and tears apart the inner turmoil Ivan does not want to face. Smerdyakov says, "You knew in advance that your own father was to be murdered, yet you left him as a sacrifice. Once people learn the whole story, how will they view you as his son?" Ivan erupts into a furious roar, but his shouts seem like self-interrogation as he yells, "Did I know that the murder was going to happen?" The second meeting or confrontation with Smerdyakov makes Ivan recall the circumstances of his father's last night at home. On that night, he eavesdropped on his father's movements from the stairs, an equally inexplicable behavior. Now, recalling it, he feels a piercing pain, realizing that he did indeed anticipate the occurrence of the crime from that night onward. At this point, a clear connection is established between whether the elder brother committed murder, whether Smerdyakov is innocent, and Ivan's own guilt. Ivan mutters to himself, uttering a thought-provoking and peculiar statement. "As long as it was Smerdyakov who killed father, not Dmitri, then I am, of course, also the murderer." Next, his girlfriend Katerina hands him a letter from Dmitri, causing ripples in his emotions. The letter states, "Dmitri is not a thief but a murderer. He killed father, ruined himself, just to be able to stand tall with dignity." For Ivan, desperately seeking exoneration, such wording serves as irrefutable evidence of his elder brother's guilt. However, his tranquility is short-lived. In the third meeting, Smerdyakov openly declares that he killed old Karamazov, but this happened with Ivan's tacit approval. Ivan is left with no choice but to acknowledge it, and unexpectedly, this confession injects him with a rejuvenating strength. He suddenly feels the confidence to end everything, deciding to testify in court, expose Smerdyakov, not only to help Dmitri escape suspicion but also to redeem his own guilt. However, Ivan's efforts end in vain. Before the trial, Smerdyakov commits suicide, leaving insufficient evidence to prove his guilt. In court, Ivan's sincere plea of "I instigated him to commit murder. I am the only culprit," is dismissed as the ramblings of a mentally disturbed individual due to his epilepsy. Katerina, caught off guard by her lover's unexpected confession, publicly reveals Dmitri's letter, confirming his so-called murderous charge. Meanwhile, in a state of extreme excitement and mental confusion, Ivan is sent to the hospital. It can be said that the core plot of Patricide in the novel presents itself in two strands. One is the murder case on a factual level, and the other is the impulse to murder on a conceptual level. Obviously, the more intricate, decisive, and captivating of the two is the latter. The true culprit, Smerdyakov, is merely the embodiment of Ivan's ideological dilemma. Clearly, the two are portrayed as mirror images by the author. Ivan can see his own shadow in Smerdyakov, including the epilepsy. Moreover, as the second son, Ivan unequivocally surpasses the eldest Dmitri, becoming the true focal point of Patricide in the novel. It goes beyond Freud's view of father and son competing for the affection of the same woman. Furthermore, do not forget that Ivan's more significant and acute act of patricide lies not in turning a deaf ear to the possible demise of his biological father but in questioning the traditional and religious norms of Russian society. In other words, on the cultural ideological level, Ivan is a son who rebels against and challenges paternal authority. In reality, in terms of a balanced ideological conflict, he and the youngest son Alyosha can be considered the dual protagonists of the brothers Karamazov. This is particularly evident in the famous chapter The Grand Inquisitor, where the emphasis is on presenting their dialogue. Many researchers argue that Ivan's role in the novel is more significant than Alyosha's. This debate remains unresolved. If the Grim Reaper had not suddenly descended, if Fyodor Dostoevsky had completed the entire Karamazov series as planned, we might have answers. However, what we have is only the first part of the entire series. The question of who prevails between Alyosha and Ivan relates to the author's own ideological orientation. As the most discussed section of the entire novel, the Grand Inquisitor cannot provide a conclusive answer. However, this chapter gives the impression that the author imparts the intensity of reason and intellectual tension to Ivan while placing the emotional depth and future hope in Alyosha. The Grand Inquisitor describes a debate surrounding a long poem written by Ivan, reflecting his westernized ideals. The poem hypothesizes that in the 16th century, Jesus comes to a world ruled by the Grand Inquisitor, performing miracles and healing people's ailments. However, the Grand Inquisitor mercilessly questions the relevance of Jesus to modern society, asserting that the pursuit of the Christ spirit is freedom of belief, not belief in miracles, hoping that people attain spiritual freedom. Yet, this becomes a torment for humans because they are foolish and weak. Freedom makes them suffer, and what they desire is the conquest of authority, miracles, secrets, and authority. Modern churches, or modern states, precisely provide these three powers. Consequently, the Grand Inquisitor provocatively challenges Jesus, saying, "Be angry then. I don't want your love, for I don't love you myself." Ivan's Grand Inquisitor doesn't believe in God, and through him, Ivan questions the traditions of Orthodox Russian culture. However, at the end of the long poem, when faced with the Grand Inquisitor's challenge, Jesus remains silent and walks over, giving him a gentle kiss. Ivan tells Alyosha, that kiss plunged into his heart a warm stream, but the Grand Inquisitor's original thoughts remained unchanged. Before parting ways, Ivan asks Alyosha if he would disown his own brother, and Alyosha, without saying a word, approaches and gives him a kiss. Based on Ivan's long poem, it is evident that between the two brothers, Ivan assumes the role of the Grand Inquisitor, while the monk Alyosha, steeped in traditional Orthodox teachings, becomes a real-life embodiment of Christ. Like Jesus, he does not engage in a debate with his brother using Western rational reasoning because that would only lead to the same pattern. Instead, he chooses a Russian-style religiously revelatory response, the silent kiss. One could argue that at this point in the novel, the portrayal of Christ like Alyosha envisions a possibility potent enough to overcome Western rationality and restore Russian spirituality. However, this kiss, though touching, is challenging to argue as countering Ivan's powerful inquiries, especially since it originates from Ivan's own assumptions. Consequently, both in terms of the symbolic significance of characters and the values the novel aims to convey, the narrative becomes more complex, eliminating the possibility of any singular interpretation. The brothers Karamazov weaves together a family story and a debate on the future of society. Dostoevsky himself proposed a concept called accidental family, which we can understand as a makeshift family, a family lacking inherent connections beyond blood relations. The Karamazov family precisely fits the description of such an accidental family, devoid of moral guidance and unable to maintain traditional inheritance. This family situation mirrors the fractured and disorderly characteristics of Russian society in the midst of the 19th century reforms. The Karamazov family falls apart, with the 5 men in the family conflicting with each other, each pursuing his own interests. However, from another perspective, they are unified under the umbrella of Karamazov character. What is the Karamazov character? At the beginning of the novel, another monk cynically remarks, "You are a family of sensualists, gluttonous, foolish, cruel." In Dmitri's confession about his debauched behavior, he laments, "Who made me a Karamazov?" Ivan tells Alyosha, "There is a force that can endure anything." That is the Karamazov style force of degradation. Perhaps it can be understood that the Karamazov character represents both the extreme of moral decline and the symbol of impactful passion, or in other words, it is conflict itself. One could even argue that only with the Karamazov character can profound questions be raised, and, as quoted at the beginning, intense tremors resonate from the depths of the great soul. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.